So you want to own an empire. Not a company, an empire. The kind that runs a quarter of the Earth's land and doesn't pay for most of it. Here's the first surprise. You don't start with soldiers. You start with a joint stock company, a royal charter, and a piece of paper from the crown that legally lets private shareholders wage war. That's not a metaphor. The English East India Company got exactly that in 1600, and by 1803 it had a private army of 260,000 men, twice the size of the British Army itself. Funny coincidence that the paperwork came before the guns. What does an empire actually sell? Why would a trading company end up governing 300 million people? And how do you turn a tea import business into the government of India? That's the video. Getting in wasn't cheap. The East India Company's founding charter cost investors £68,373 in initial capital in 1600, roughly £13 million today. And that only bought you a monopoly license from Elizabeth I, not a single ship or acre. You then needed Parliament's continued blessing, renewed and renegotiated every 20 years, plus bribes to MPs that historians estimate ran £100,000 a year by the 1690s, just to keep the charter alive. The regulatory body wasn't a modern agency. It was the Crown and Parliament directly, and the license was really a war against every other European power, already doing the same thing. The Dutch VOC got there first, in 1602, with 10 times the starting capital. The faster path was simpler. Don't build an empire, buy one that's already collapsing. When the Mughal Empire fractured after 1707, the East India Company didn't invade India. It bought Indian debt, Indian tax collection rights, and Indian armies wholesale. In 1757, Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal at Plassey, not with brute force but with a bribe. He paid off the Nawab's own general, Mir Jafar, roughly £2 million in today's money, to switch sides mid-battle. The company inherited the entire tax revenue of Bengal, about £2 million a year, then worth more than the entire company's paid-up capital, for the price of one bribe. Compare that to how Britain did it in Africa a century later. In India, conquest was outsourced to a company and paid for by loot. In Africa after 1885, it was nationalized from day one. The Berlin Conference carved up the continent among governments directly, no shareholder middlemen, because by then, everyone had learned what happens when a private company runs a subcontinent. The Congo Free State, run personally by Belgium's King Leopold II as a private business rather than a colony, killed an estimated 10 million people extracting rubber, and even European governments called that one too far. Here's the stat that breaks the polite version of this story. At its peak around 1938, the British Empire covered 13.7 million square miles and ruled 458 million people, 20% of the entire world's population, using a home civil service in India of fewer than 1,000 British administrators. That's one British official for every 300,000 Indians. The empire wasn't held together by manpower. It was held together by local collaborators, debt, and the threat of the Royal Navy, which by 1889 was legally required to be larger than the next two navies combined. So what happened when the locals didn't cooperate? The empire's insurance policy was terror, applied selectively and covered by its own courts. After the 1857 Indian Rebellion, British forces killed an estimated 100,000 to 800,000 people in reprisals. Historians still argue over the number because record-keeping conveniently stopped. What the system did not cover was accountability back home. No British general was ever imprisoned for a colonial reprisal killing before 1919. And even after Amritsar, where General Reginald Dyer ordered troops to fire on an unarmed crowd on April 13, 1919, killing at least 379 people in 10 minutes, Dyer's punishment was early retirement on a full pension, funded in part by a public subscription in Britain that raised him £26,000, about £1.5 million today. So why would anyone actually do this? Why does an empire make money? Here's the mechanism nobody puts in the textbook version. An empire isn't primarily a tax operation. It's a captive market operation. Colonies were legally required, under navigation acts dating to 1651, to sell raw materials only to Britain and buy manufactured goods only from Britain, at prices Britain set. India grew the cotton. Britain's mills in Manchester wove it into cloth. India then had to buy that cloth back. its own raw material, marked up, because British tariffs on Indian-made cloth ran as high as 70 to 80% by the 1820s, deliberately pricing India's own textile industry out of its own market. Walk the numbers small. In 1700, India produced about 25% of world manufacturing output, mostly textiles. By 1900, that had collapsed to under 2%. Take one Bengali weaver's household, pre-1757. A family might net the equivalent of £15 a year, selling hand-woven cloth locally and regionally. By 1830, tariff walls and company monopoly pricing had cut that same household's income to under £4 a year, while the raw cotton they grew was bought by the company at fixed low prices and shipped to Lancashire, woven, and sold back into the Indian market at a markup historians estimate averaged 30 to 50%. The margin didn't disappear, it moved to Manchester. Scale that to the whole colony, and the numbers get obscene. Economist Utsa Patnaik's 2018 analysis calculated that Britain drained approximately $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938, adjusted to today's dollars, through this exact mechanism of forced trade terms plus tax-funded home charges. India paid Britain for the privilege of being administered. Even the more conservative estimates from Angus Maddison put Britain's extraction at reducing India's share of global GDP from 24.4% in 1700 to 4.2% by 1950. That's the scale-up, not a single company's balance sheet, but the GDP of a nation quietly redirected for 2 centuries. While this brief pauses, a word on the kind of exposure that outlasts empires: your personal data. The same extraction logic that moved wealth out of India moves your information out of your control today. Data brokers buy and resell your address, income bracket, and browsing habits the same way the company bought tax rights, except you never signed a charter. Incogni scans the brokers selling your data and files removal requests on your behalf, automatically, on an ongoing basis. It won't stop an empire, but it'll stop your name from being the raw material in someone else's trade route. Links in the description. Back to the mechanism. Because taxation was the second revenue stream, running parallel to trade extraction. After 1858, when the Crown took direct control from the company following the 1857 rebellion, India was required to pay home charges, the cost of its own administration, British Army pensions, and interest on railway loans Britain issued to itself. By 1901, home charges consumed roughly £17.5 million a year, about 24% of India's entire central government revenue, paid to London for the privilege of being ruled. India also funded its own conquest. The Opium Wars against China in 1839 and 1856 were fought using opium grown under British monopoly in Bengal, sold into China against Chinese law, generating up to 17% of British India's total revenue in some years during the 1880s, from a drug trade Britain fought 2 wars to protect. Now the scandal, and this one has a name: the Bengal famine of 1770. Company policy under Governor Warren Hastings kept tax collection at full rate even as crop failure hit, extracting revenue while an estimated 10 million people, a third of Bengal's population, starved to death. The company's own directors in London recorded a profit increase the following year. Hastings was later impeached by Parliament in 1788 on corruption charges, put on trial for 7 years, and acquitted in 1795. He kept his fortune. Nobody went to prison. The company's stock price didn't move. The bigger collapse came in 1943, in Bengal again. Wartime policy under Churchill's War Cabinet diverted rice exports away from Bengal to build stockpiles for European theaters, and refused to redirect food ships, despite documented warnings from the government of India as early as July 1943. Between 2.1 and 3 million people died of starvation and related disease over roughly 8 months, from spring to December 1943, in a famine that internal British records show was driven by hoarding, price speculation, and deliberate export policy rather than any actual regional food shortage. Bengal's total food supply that year was not catastrophically low. Leopold Amery, Secretary of State for India, later wrote in his diary that Churchill compared him to Hitler during a war cabinet argument over food aid. Field Marshal Wavell, who became viceroy in October 1943 and finally redirected shipping to feed the region, wrote privately that London's handling of the famine was negligent, hostile, and contemptuous. No minister was ever tried. Churchill remained Prime Minister until 1945 and was voted out only after the war ended, for reasons unrelated to Bengal. Pull the lessons out of that one directly. First, an empire's accounting treats a colony's population as a cost center, not a constituency. So when profit and survival conflict, survival loses, and the paperwork calls it policy rather than a crime. Second, distance is the mechanism of deniability. Decisions made in London in 1943 killed people in Calcutta who never appeared as a line item until historians went looking 80 years later. Third, the people who make the fatal call are almost never the people who face consequences for it. Churchill got a state funeral in 1965, 22 years after Bengal. Here's the insider stat that reframes the whole thing. The empire's own internal audits show that corruption by British officials in India, bribery, embezzlement, private fortunes built on public office, so-called nabobs, who returned to England after a few years in Bengal with fortunes exceeding £200,000, worried Parliament more consistently than the death tolls did. Edmund Burke spent years pursuing Hastings specifically because returning nabobs were destabilizing British domestic politics by buying seats in Parliament outright. The empire feared its own employees stealing more than it feared what its policies did to the people it ruled. Zoom out, and the structural truth is this. The British Empire wasn't a government project that happened to make money. It was a monetization scheme that eventually required a government to protect it. Private shareholders financed the initial conquest because the state wouldn't risk its own capital on the uncertainty. The state stepped in once the profits were proven and the risks needed nationalizing. That's the same pattern behind railroads, colonial oil concessions, and modern private military contractors. Risk gets privatized on the way in, and cost gets socialized on the way out, and whoever owns the shares at the start captures the difference. Break down what ownership actually returned. Small-scale version, a mid-tier East India Company shareholder around 1750, holding £1,000 of stock, about £180,000 today, collected dividends that company records show averaged 8 to 10% annually through the mid-1700s, roughly £80 to £100 a year, tax-advantaged and largely disconnected from any personal risk, since the company's private army bore the actual cost in blood. Large-scale version, the company itself, at its 1803 peak, generated annual revenues from Indian territories alone of roughly £13 million, funded a private military larger than most European states, and returned enough surplus that Parliament taxed the company's profits directly starting in 1793, specifically because they'd become too large to ignore. A realistic modern equivalent annual profit, north of £1 billion, extracted from a country that never got a vote on any of it. So that's the real business model behind the empire that painted a quarter of the map pink. Not conquest for glory, but conquest as a leveraged buyout, financed by the people being bought. Turns out the sun never set on the British Empire, for the same reason a landlord never sleeps on rent day. Someone always owed.